Hi, I'm Reva with Quality Sewing and Vacuum, and today we are going to be talking about threads. So if you if this is your first time you joined in on our weekly series, then welcome. And if you want to catch some of our past ones, you can always go to our website at qualitysewing.com, or you can visit our YouTube channel and look for our past How Do I in the series. So today we, we are talking about thread. Now, when we started kind of brainstorming on this idea, I thought, well, I'll talk about basic thread and then embroidery thread, right? Well, then I started going through my threads at home, and most of these are some of mine. And there was a lot more threads, so I thought that we would talk about that. Now, we do love it if you have questions, if you would ask them, and we can make it interactive. That would be really fabulous, because we want to make sure that we get all the content that you want and that you're interested in, spoken about. So please just type in the chat, and we'll answer those questions as we go, should you have any. So let's start with regular sewing thread or construction thread. Now, what is that? Now, that is the thread you're going to use if you're sewing a project. Maybe you're making a pair of pajamas. You might be sewing a tote bag, something like that. Usually, it is a matte thread, and it is really strong. This one happens to be 100% polyester. You can find some that are cotton, but mostly a construction thread is going to be a polyester. Sometimes it says it's a polyester wrapped, cotton wrapped around polyester core or something like that. Okay, so this is what you're going to use when you do regular sewing. Okay, there's usually lots of colors that you can find in this, and I really like this brand. It doesn't lint very much, and it's really strong. Now, you also might find something that says it's a silk finish, and this is also a lovely, lovely thread, but this one is 100% cotton. So things that you want to consider if you're making something with 100% cotton thread is that cotton will shrink, polyester won't. So that might be a determining factor for you there. And then when you're doing your regular sewing, this isn't really, we're not really going to talk too much about needles today, but with needles, you match the weight of the thread and what you're sewing on, or the style of sewing you're doing. So if you're doing a regular sewing and you're making a project, you want to match that needle style to the type of fabric that you're working on. Is it knit? Is it woven? That type of thing. Okay. Now, if you're doing a technique like a buttonhole on a wool coat, then you can get this same thread in what's called a buttonhole twist, and it's heavier. And so it's really quite heavy, but it looks beautiful on a buttonhole. Okay. So then you can look for that. Okay. Now, if you want to use your serger, then there are serger threads. Now, as we progress here, let me give you one kind of a good true thing. And that is, if it's a really super good bargain, it's probably not. Inexpensive threads can be inferior in their construction. Like if you notice, this is, I don't know if you can, I'll put it maybe down on the dark surface here. You can notice how nice and smooth this is. Whereas an inexpensive thread might have slubs with weak spots and thick spots. So you may get inconsistent stitches, and you might get poor stitch quality. You might get skip stitches, threads break, things like that. Okay, so you always want to make sure you have a quality thread. And if you are a bargain shopper online and you find a really good deal of really good thread online, it might not be a good deal, because maybe that was an inferior product that got discarded by the manufacturer and reclaimed by someone else and sold. So just be aware of that, because you want to have a happy sewing experience, right? Okay, so you'll see that a lot in serger thread. So serger thread is really quite nice. You're going to find it on a bigger cone because you go through more of it. And it is a thinner weight. I don't even know if you can see. It's one of those things that kind of shows up more in person than it does in a video. But the turquoise thread is the sewing thread. It is heavier weight than this navy thread that is a serger thread. And the reason for that is that when you're serging a seam, you have a lot more thread that goes around and binds the edge of the seam, and it goes through the area where a straight stitch would just be one line. So it can be a heavier thread. So serger threads are lighter weight because they're used in mass, right? 3 or 4 threads at a time. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, that it wouldn't be really the best result to use multiple spools of sewing thread if you're serging. Okay, so you want a lighter weight thread there. Now, on the sewing side, I brought this one. If you have a spool that looks like this, you probably don't really want to use it. I've kept this for sentimental reasons. This was my dad's thread that he used to repair his briefcases with. But this is a buttonhole twist. It's really, really heavy, but this is more of a hand thread. But the reason why I say you wouldn't want to use this is because this is obviously from the 70s or something like that. And thread does have a shelf life. And so it can go bad, especially if it's cotton. I remember one time I was using some silk finish thread and I was making a pair of slacks, and they were beautiful. I put a lot of time into them, made sure the pockets were just perfect. Everything was just perfect about them. And I noticed that while I was sewing that the thread left little flakes. It was little flakes of, around. Every time I sew, it just had little, it almost like it had dandruff. And that was just a good sign that thread was rotten, because the first time I got in the car, the whole seat ripped out, and so the whole pair of pants that I spent hours on was no good because I used rotten thread. And that does happen. So this I wouldn't use anyway because, it's kind of special. Okay, now let's talk about quilting. So when we're quilting, this cone looks a lot like this cone, but this one happens to be quilting thread, and this one happens to be serger thread. They do look a lot alike. They are the same. They're both polyester, which, by the way, for quilting, a lot of people are using polyester thread because it's not linty, and you can get a nice finish and you don't get all that gook in your machine. But this is really nice because it also is a fine thread. I was trying to find the end there. It's a fine thread as well, because when you're quilting, you need your seam to be finer or the stitch to be thinner, because every morsel of space counts. So if I was using a regular construction thread, which you can do, this is chubbier, so when you go to press your seam open, the fabric has to go up and over thicker thread. So therefore, if you needed 4 inches, you cut your piece to 4.5 inches and you sew your 1/4 inch seam and then you press it open, it's probably going to be less than 4 inches because it took too much space, right? It's chubbier. This is skinnier, so you can get that over the thread easier. Okay, so this is finer thread, but it's not the same as the serger thread. Okay, so because this actually has to sew a seam by itself, this works in conjunction with other spools, other cones of thread at the same time. Okay, more than just one. All right, any questions? Just throw them out there. Another thread that's used, and this is really used for long arm or quilting, doing the quilting stitches. If you're doing your piecing, you might use a thread like this. Now, thread weights are really, they're probably different than what you would think. So a thread weight, the higher the number of the thread, the finer it is. The smaller the number, the heavier it is. So if you're working with this thread, and I'm going to take the end off so I can get my little piece out. This is a 50 weight thread, so it's really nice and fine. It is finer than the regular sewing thread is. I don't know if you can see. You can probably just see how that just even looks stiffer. So this is heavier than this thread, and this is designed for quilting. Okay, but this is 100% cotton, which is great. And some people really prefer to quilt with or piece with a cotton thread. So you can make that choice. And that used to be the standard, but is not necessarily the standard any longer. Then we have a couple other threads here that are quilting related. This is a 60 weight, and this is even finer yet than this one, right? Because let me make sure I did say the right one. Yeah, he's a 50. So this one's a 60 weight, so it's even thinner than that one. So it's going to give you less to have to press and accommodate when you're pressing your item open. And then this one is really awesome because this is an 80 weight. Let's see if you can see how fine that is. And let me just I'll put our regular thread down so you can see kind of a difference there maybe. Because the orange is the 80 weight, so it's really super fine. And this is good for doing your topical quilting, the quilting of your layers, putting them together. And this would actually meld into the fabric and not be so much of a show off of the thread. Okay, so if you're doing quilting, that works, but it also is great in your bobbin, and we will talk about bobbins in a little bit too. Because if you have a lighter weight thread and you're going to put that in your bobbin for doing decorative things, then you get more thread on the bobbin so it lasts longer. Okay, another thing that you might run across, and let me see, this is similar to this thread here. This is a called Perfect Cotton Plus, and it is has that nice quilt or cotton finish. Whereas this thread, if I can't get it out right now. This is 100% cotton, and it's very fine. This is a 50 weight, but it's 100% cotton, and this happens to be a DMC thread, so you're going to get the same colors as the DMC floss that you find in the store. And this was made using that thread where I made the crochet on the sewing machine using wash away stabilizer. So it's just a decorative stitch. And then all the stitches were done using that 100% cotton 50 weight thread. Okay. So that's kind of a fun thing to make it look like heirloom. Okay. So now let's talk about some other threads that are for sewing but are a little bit different. You might have something that looks like this. It comes in white, it comes in navy, black. I know there's a red out there, probably other colors, but this is actually an elastic thread. Now this thread, you're not going to sew with in your needle. You would put this in your bobbin, and you would either wind the bobbin very, very slowly or hand wind your bobbin. And what it will do is give the stretch that's, if you make a straight stitch, it's going to stretch. The fabric may gather, but it will actually stretch when you wear it. So if you think of some of those smocked or the sundresses that had the elastic in the fabric, or some cuffs have that, that's what this thread does. And then I have here a thread that I'm sure everyone has in their sewing room, and this is a monofilament thread. So I've got two different brands here, but they're both a monopoly, and they come in different weights too. But this, you can see, is perfectly clear. You're going to have two different versions. This is the smoke, and it will look clear on darker fabrics, so it kind of blends in there. But if I was using a white, I'd want to use the clear, because this would show. It kind of looks like a hair on lightweight or light colored fabrics. So you can use this for hems and other things that you don't want the thread to show. And then there's two different manufacturing styles of this, or makeup of it. This is a poly, and then the ones that you might remember as a kid was nylon. And nylon is the one that gives you the scratchy tags in the back of your shirt because it's stiff, and if you iron it, it gets a crusty ball on it. It like melts and makes a really hard lump. Polyester is more not as heat sensitive, so it's more tolerant to heat, so you can it will stay soft. Okay, so that's a good one to have. Then other things that you might find interesting is a wash away thread. something that you can do a basting stitch or a temporary stitch, and then it will just wash out. And then there's also fusible thread, and this is awesome for if you want to do a hem. You can run a straight stitch on the edge of the hem, fold it up, and then press it into place, and it will hold it while you do your final hemming. It's also really good for doing bindings, things like that. Okay. All right. Now let's get into decorative threads. And that would be, we're going to talk about embroidery thread for this. We have embroidery thread. General embroidery thread is a 40 weight. So it's going to be heavier than our quilting threads and about the same weight as a construction thread, but it's not as tightly wound. It's a little bit more relaxed. It has a nicer flow to it. So it fills in really lovely on embroidery. And I was looking for, here's the one that has some embroidery on it. Okay, so this, the embroidery just really does a really nice job of filling in for embroidery. If you were to use a sewing thread or a construction thread, you would see through this. It would not look really very well at all. So you want to use an embroidery thread. And embroidery threads are also really fun to do when using decorative stitches. So this is all embroidery thread that was used to do those decorative stitches there. And then I also have this one right here to show you. This is all done using decorative threads of different styles. So this is a standard embroidery thread here, whereas this one is a heavier weight, and we'll talk about him in just a second. But you can use the decorative stitches on your machine to do some really, really pretty finishing for your project. Okay. All right. So that is just the general of embroidery thread. However, let's get this little guy out and let's talk about weights of embroidery thread, because this is a 40 weight thread. This is a 40 weight. That's the standard embroidery weight. But then you have these little guys here that are an 80 weight, and they're really fine and tiny. They are 100% polyester, but they're great for small lettering. They're good for small details, and they're great for outlines. So let's take a look at this really really quickly. So we have some different weights of thread. So that's our 40 weight embroidery thread, but this is our 80 weight thin thread with the same stitches, and this is 50 weight here. Okay, so you can see the difference between those. Now hopefully you can see the difference here. If you take a look at this design right here, this is all using 40 weight thread, and you can see the lettering is tiny, but see how it's kind of thick and a little bit, well, kind of gloppy, and the outlines around your items are really, really strong. If you come up here and take a look, this is using the 80 weight thread. Look at how much more clear the lettering is and how much in scale or not as heavy the outline is here, because that's using that thinner thread. So if you want, it's more in scale, right? More in scale with the actual design. Another tip is if you're doing outline like on animals and people and things like that, instead of using black as your outline, considering using a charcoal or a dark brown, because that's a softer color than black, and that might give you a better or more realistic outline than just using a heavy black thread. And it really can make a huge difference in the finished appearance of your item. You can also use this thread for doing your quilting with your embroidery machine and things like that, because it would meld into the surface of your fabric so your texture shows off. Okay. Now, if you want your stitches to show off on something like that, that's when you would use something like this. This is a 12 weight thread. This happens to be 100% cotton. It is called King Tut, or I'm sorry, this is a sulky thread, but it's similar to a King Tut, but it's 100% cotton, and it is a heavy weight thread. So that's going to show up more. So when we were looking at this one right here, you can see that these stitches are more pronounced, because this was a heavyweight thread that was used to stitch them. Now they do look really, really heavy because this stitch actually repeats over itself several times to get itself in place and to make the stitch. It's not just a one pass. That's why it looks even heavier. But the cotton threads can be really pretty for doing decorative things. I wouldn't want to sew a seam with them because with all the dyeing and stuff, they may not be strong enough to sew a seam. And remember that they're thicker because it's a 12 weight thread. It's thicker, so then it's going to have a more difficult time getting your everything to lay flat, because it's going to have to go up and over that bump. Okay. All right. So then in with the 12 weight thread, we also have 12 weight embroidery thread. And this is a beautiful poly thread. It has the high shine like the other embroidery threads do, but it is 12 weight. Now 12 weight thread is about as heavy as you're going to be able to get through the eye of a needle. So if you're working with a thread this thick, or a buttonhole twist even, you may need to go to a needle like a top stitch needle because it has a larger eye and it also has a deeper groove down the front of the shaft of the needle to accommodate the thickness of the thread that's passing down through the needle. So that will help alleviate a lot of issues with thread shredding and breaking of threads. Okay. All right. So we'll go on to more fun threads, and that would be metallic threads. So I've got 3 different types here of metallic threads. This one has a smooth finish. This one is kind of more, you can see the twist, and this one is a mylar thread. Let's start with the mylar one. This one is really pretty cool. It's kind of like it's made out of tinsel. I don't know if you can see that. It's a flat, almost like dental floss kind of a look to it. It's flat and it's kind of a little bit wide, but it's like hair thin this way, and it's a little bit wider on the pretty side. And this is a decorative thread for you to do decorative stitches. You can do embroidery with it, but it is very, very tender. So you're going to want to be careful with that. So I have this little guy here to show you. This was all stitched out with a mylar thread similar to this, and it's really quite lovely on that. In fact, it had the same thread in the bobbin, so it gives a very, very pretty effect, but it is very tender thread, so depending on the machine you're working with, it may react better in some cases and a little bit more temperamental in others. So just know that. And then standard embroidery metallic thread is so pretty. You're going to want to use a metallic needle because, again, the eye is designed to work with the metallic threads. It's smoother. It has a better path. But I don't know if you can see, this guy's having a real bad hair day. Can you see that? He's just all over the place here. So let's talk about ways that you can work with a metallic thread. A metallic thread, oh, and I'll show you this too. See how my thread is kind of tucked down on the bottom? A lot of spools will pop open like this, so then you can unwind and then you pop them back down, or they may have a little notch in here that you can control the ends of your threads with. Okay, so this guy's having a bad hair day because he's been in my drawer of threads. But metallic threads can be persnickety because being actual metal, they can get static electricity and they can have all sorts of kind of wacky ideas. And I kind of think they have a mind of their own. So there's a couple things that you can do to help combat that. So one is to use a thread stand. So this you would put off to the side of your sewing machine, and then you put your spool of thread on there, and then this telescopes up, and then you put your thread. Well, let me just see if I can get my fingers to work. We'll put our thread through that loop, and then it will start getting the thread to kind of do its business down here. So then you can thread your machine over here. And that gives it time to kind of relax. I kind of think of it as time out for the thread. And that way he can get he knows he needs to behave, right? So that way when you get to the machine, it's a little bit more calmed down. And the static electricity you have in your house depends on the weather that's outside, where you live, all sorts of things. So,
Reva, is that stand weighted so it doesn't fall over?
yeah, it is heavier on the bottom than it is here. So it is really stable. You can, kind of hear it. It's stable. Some of them are metal bases. This one is not a metal base, but it does have weights inside. So that's a really good question. Now, there is one more thing that you can do. Oh, and by the way, please do not put this near the hand wheel of your machine. You don't want this anywhere getting near that because it will suck right in, and then that's an issue. And you'll have to take it to service to get it all taken out. So make sure you're clear of your machine completely. Have it way to the back or way off to the side. Another thing you can do if your thread is being persnickety and not very cooperative is to use a thread net. Now this one's really, really long. So, seriously, isn't it way too big for this? So if you cut it in half, you'd have 2 nets, not just one. No, that's not how you use them. That's what I did when I first got thread nets because I thought that's what, made sense to me. But that's not how you use them. So what you do is you take your whole thread net and you put your spool in it, let it come off the top, and you can puddle the other up underneath it so it fits just fine. But now you have your little thread net coming up to help control any of that wackiness that the thread may have. And if you have a spool that's shaped like this, that's embroidery thread, it's going to want to pool off and puddle. So if you use a thread net, that will help control that. Okay, so this can take care of a lot of things. And then there is another item, and I forgot to grab it, but it's the thread. What does it carry? The thread.
IDT, ideal thread. Something.
Thread manager, thread. Ultimate thread
dispenser.
Ultimate thread dispenser. Yeah. So you can look for that because what that does. Hey, Matt, would you bring us an ultimate thread dispenser, please? Thank you. We'll come back to that. Okay, isn't Matt awesome? Okay, so we'll show you that too. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. That's all good. Now let's get into some other threads that I just grabbed because I had them. This is another style of spool, but this is a 12 weight thread again. So this can go through the eye of the needle. That's great. But you can also do some other things with them. You can couch. I'll show you that. You can use it in your serger. You can do all sorts of things like that. Thank you, sir. Okay, so this is the ultimate thread dispenser. And what this does is when you put your little spool on here. Let's just take him, I guess. Nope, he's too small. We'll just take we'll take our spool here, and then you take your thread and you put it through that guide, and you can set this on your vertical spool pin on your machine, and as you sew, it just spools off. Now, why that can make a difference is depending on your spool type. Because if you have a vertical spool pin that doesn't move, well, then obviously this isn't going to work because it's going to just kind of pull. And have you ever done that? You've sewn and you go kind of fast and it goes bloop and it just like spins and it tugs and it pulls. So you don't really want that. You want a nice smooth delivery of your thread. Also, some threads stitch better if they come off the spool one way as opposed to coming off this way. Okay, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. So if you're having trouble with your thread, try something like this so it can just spool so smoothly.
And how does that spool so smoothly, Reva?
Oh, it's magic. Let me get this out of here. That's a good question. How does it spool so smoothly? It has in it, well, I guess I can't take it apart. It's 2 pieces right here. So you have the base that has the thread eye. See, there's an eye here and can you see that little nip right there? Your thread slips in there, and this will direct the thread the way it's supposed to go. And then there's a little lazy Susan on the top that will turn. Okay, good question. Okay, so speaking of 12 weight threads, there also are like these sets are 12 weight threads. They're so pretty. You can use this for handwork as well as machine. Do I have any 12 weight thread? We'll talk about that in a second, I guess. Okay, so, but that's that. Now, this one is actually a 20 weight, so it's not quite as thin or as heavy as a 12 weight. So this one also could go through a machine, but you can see that's a beautiful decorative thread. So if you want to have your stitches, like decorative stitches from your machine, look really amazing, use a heavier weight thread, because then it will have more presence to it. Okay, and I did want to show you this a little bit. If you get a spool like this or a spool like this, you see it's coated in plastic. Can you see the little hair that's standing up the one little end of the thread? So how this is put on the spool, if you see them wrapped like this and you see just a tiny little bit of that, it's designed for you to take that and pull it off, and then that will break open the seal of the wrapper, so then it's easy to get to it without using scissors and then getting in there and cutting your thread. Okay, all right, so we've done metallic, we've done some heavyweight. Let's talk about sergers. We talked a little bit about a serger thread, but there are other threads that just won't go through an eye of the needle or do it well that is really great to use in your serger. So that would be a thread like this. This is a 6 weight. Look at how thick that is. But it's really pretty because it is a rayon thread, and it's really, really beautiful. But it's too heavy to go through the eye of the needle. So it works really well on a serger, so you can do your decorative stitches in the chain looper of your machine. So this was done with the right side of the fabric down and these threads in the chain looper of the machine. And so it braided them, and you probably can't, you might not be able to see it, but you might see just a little kind of a pinprick of like the blue in here, because my needle thread was blue, and then this kind of pearl color is heavier weight, and it was in the bottom looper. Okay, so you can do that. You might also do something that's called couching. And this is a heavier weight thread like what I just showed you, only it was couched on. And to do that, what you do is you lay it on top and you stitch with regular thread over the top. So you're anchoring it on to the fabric. Okay, so that was done with a sewing machine, but laying it on top. Now, another thing that you can do, which is really cool, is to use a thread like that.
Get that. Could you try again?
No. You can use a thread like that, and this is that same decor, only a different color, and I put this in the bobbin of my embroidery machine, and I embroidered it upside down, so I was able to get this really neat thick line. So I used the right side of the fabric face down, and I had just this color thread in the needle to secure this down. Okay, so you can do, and that's called bobbin work, when you have heavier weight threads in your bobbin, and then you sew with the right side down. Okay, so that's a fun technique too. And then there's other threads that you might have, and I've had these for a really long time. This is a wool thread that has like a sweater type fuzzy texture to it, and this is designed for embroidery, so you can get a nice texture. People even have done things with this and then use a steel brush and brushed out the fluff and made it look like a real puppy, you know, so it's kind of cute. And then this is another really heavy one that is just a beautiful, beautiful thread. But again, this is the this is a 15 weight. So this is a really pretty one. Okay. All right. Then another thread that you might like to use for your serger is a woolly poly. Now this thread is, you see when I pull it, it's straight. When I let go, it puffs up. So this is, you'll see this used a lot in performance wear, like yoga pants or moisture wicking shirts, used in the hems. It'll be used in the seams. And the reason why is because it has stretch to it. And also you can use this, let me show you this one. You can use it if you're doing a rolled hem, because when you stitch with a woolly poly, it's thin when it sews, but then when you're done and it relaxes, it fills up beautifully, and it does a beautiful job on a rolled hem. So if you're making napkins and table runners and things like that, this is a great thread to use for that. Anyway, look for a woolly poly, because again, it's not as heat sensitive. Woolly nylon, if you were to press this cute little cotton dress, you would probably ruin your hem because it would melt, whereas a woolly poly won't. Okay. All right. Last thing I have to show you here is bobbins. I just wanted to talk a little bit about bobbin thread. When you find a pre-wound bobbin like these, most times these are for embroidery. So they're a lighter weight thread. This one happens to be a 60 weight. This is an 80 weight. So they're very, very fine and very, very thin, but that means you're going to get a lot more thread on one bobbin than you would if you were to wind it yourself with a 40 weight or whatever thread you're working with. Now you can get pre-wound bobbins in 100% cotton quilting weight. So that way, if you're doing piecing, you could use those. Also, if you have a long arm machine, you can get them in cotton and polyester for your long arm, so you don't have to wind those. But you can also get them in packs with a bunch of colors. Sometimes it's all one color. This happens to be a variety pack. And then you usually can find bobbin weight thread in white and in black. And this is really fun if you like the idea of having a pre-wound bobbin, but you know that you're running a luxury machine that maybe or maybe a persnickety machine, and you want to make sure you're using its proper parts, because these are generic bobbins. They are not the specific ones designed for your machine. So you're always going to get the best results of sewing when you're working with the bobbins that are proper for your machine. So you could buy a spool out of this and have a bunch of empty bobbins and pre-wind the whole spool. Then you have your own pre-wound bobbins that match your machine. So that's another option. And then if you're going to wind a bobbin using the heavyweight thread, a lot of times your bobbin will have a little hole in the side that you can feed the thread up from the middle up out through there, and that will help it get started. But wind on a slower speed or hand wind if you would like to. I prefer to do a slower speed because I don't like to do anything by hand if I can avoid it. But getting it in here, if you have one of those dental floss threaders, that might work to help you get it through that little hole. So, okay, so that is kind of a rundown of a whole bunch of different types of threads. So I hope that is helpful for you. And then we will see you next time with a whole different topic.